27 leaders walked into that room. One man walked out smiling. On March 19th, the European Union held an emergency summit in Brussels. Every head of government, every major leader, all of them with one single mission: convince Viktor Orbán to release the €90 billion loan for Ukraine. They spent an hour and a half trying, one by one, around the table. In the harshest terms Brussels has used in years. Unacceptable, disloyal, blackmail, every word they had. And then a European official stepped out and told reporters exactly what had happened inside that room. 5 words. 5 words that summarize the entire state of European politics right now. Viktor is still not budging. And then Orbán walked out. And Politico reported that he left the summit in high spirits, calling it his major victory, smiling, while 26 leaders stood behind him in fury and had nothing to show for it. This is not a story about a summit. This is the story of how one man set a trap, and the entire European Union walked straight into it. And now they cannot get out. Let's go through exactly what happened. Because the mainstream media gives you the anger, the quotes, the condemnations, but they never give you the trap. And without the trap, you cannot understand why Brussels is truly panicking right now. It starts 4 months ago. In December 2025, all 27 EU leaders sat in the same room and agreed. A €90 billion loan for Ukraine. 2 years of funding, 2026 and 2027. Signed. Agreed. Done. Orbán was in the room. Orbán signed the agreement. Everyone went home satisfied. And then January came. And the Druzhba pipeline, the artery that carries Russian oil directly into Hungary and Slovakia, went dark. Ukraine said it was damaged in a drone strike. Hungary presented satellite images showing the damage was not from a drone. Kiev refused an independent inspection. The oil stopped flowing, and Orbán made a simple, public, one-sentence demand: give us our oil, and then we talk about your money. Brussels called it blackmail. Zelensky called it blackmail. 26 leaders called it blackmail. But here's what nobody in the mainstream media is telling you. The word blackmail only works if the demand is unreasonable. And a landlocked country of 10 million people demanding that its only oil supply not be cut off is not an unreasonable demand. That is the trap. Orbán did not demand anything radical. He did not demand that Ukraine surrender. He did not demand that the EU change its foreign policy. He demanded oil, the same oil Hungary has been receiving for decades, the same oil that powers Hungarian factories, Hungarian homes, Hungarian hospitals. He demanded the thing his country literally cannot survive without. And Brussels had no answer. Because you cannot stand in front of the world and say, we will cut off your energy supply and you must pay us anyway. You cannot make that argument. And so instead, they called it blackmail. And Orbán kept smiling. Because he knew exactly what he was doing. Now listen very carefully to what happened at the summit on March 19th. Because the details tell a story that no single headline captures. Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz went first. He called Orbán's move an act of serious disloyalty. He said what happened in the council was not acceptable and would be prevented in the future. He suggested that EU decisions should be taken by qualified majority rather than unanimity. To stop this from happening again, European Council President Antonio Costa stood at the podium and said, "A deal is a deal. Nobody can blackmail the European Council." Dutch Prime Minister Rob Jetten called the veto unacceptable and demanded the funds be delivered as quickly as possible. Finnish Prime Minister Petteri Orpo accused Orbán of using Ukraine as a weapon in his election campaign. Belgian Prime Minister Bart de Wever said the veto seemed to be part of Orbán's election campaign, called the U-turn unacceptable. 26 leaders, 1 hour and 30 minutes. Every word in the diplomatic arsenal. And the result? No movement from Orbán. That is a direct quote from a European diplomat after the talks ended. No movement from Orbán. Not, we made progress. Not, we are optimistic. No movement. And then Orbán walked to the reporters and said this: "We are ready to support Ukraine when we get our oil, which is being blocked by them. Until then, there is no decision favorable for Ukraine." Clean. Simple. Unmovable. He did not attack Europe. He did not threaten anyone. He stated a condition. And he left. Now here's the detail that Politico buried and that no German or French outlet connected to the rest of the picture. Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, who leads the third largest economy in the EU, reportedly expressed support for Budapest's stance. Not publicly. Not from the podium. But in the room. Think about what that means. The EU needed unanimity. They had 25 endorsements on the summit conclusions. Hungary and Slovakia were the holdouts. But now, Meloni, quietly, is not standing against Orbán either. The coalition that Brussels assumed was solid is starting to develop cracks that nobody is talking about in public. And there is one more number that makes this entire situation even more explosive. Orbán's next card. Hungary will not approve the EU budget for the next 7 years if it does not receive its frozen EU funds first. Read that again. Not just the 90 billion Ukraine loan. The entire 7-year EU budget. Hundreds of billions of euros. The financial architecture of the entire bloc for the next decade. Orbán has stated publicly that he will block it all, unless Brussels releases the funds it has been withholding from Hungary for years. This is not a veto anymore. This is a siege, and Brussels built the walls themselves by freezing Hungarian money for years and assuming Orbán would eventually comply. He did not comply. He waited. And now he is holding the budget of the entire European Union in one hand and the 90 billion Ukraine loan in the other. And the EU has no legal way to remove either card from his hands. Now let's talk about what Brussels is actually planning, because this is the part that the mainstream media reports in isolation. And that only makes sense when you see it all together. Option 1. Legal action. Politico reports that the European Commission is drafting a lawsuit against Hungary. The precise legal basis is still being worked out, but the signal is clear. Brussels wants to take Orbán to court. Option 2. Article 7. Stripping Hungary of its voting rights in the EU Council. The so-called nuclear option. The same option that EU experts have said for years is practically impossible to activate, because it requires unanimous agreement from all other member states. And Slovakia will not vote against Budapest. Option 3. Wait for the election. Hungary votes on April 12th. If Orbán loses, the problem disappears. If he wins, all of these options become even harder to execute. And here is the most devastating detail of all. Belgian Prime Minister De Wever said it openly at the summit. We may have to wait until after Hungary's election to implement the loan. The EU Council President himself acknowledged it. The entire bloc. 450 million people, a $2 trillion budget, the world's largest single market, is sitting in a waiting room, waiting for one country's election, waiting to see if one man gets voted out. That is not a union of equals making decisions together. That is a machine that has been brought to a complete stop by a single switch. And the switch is in Budapest. Now let's talk about the money, because this is always where the real picture emerges. 90 billion euros. That is the number frozen right now. That is the 2-year commitment to Ukraine for 2026 and 2027. Germany's share alone is approximately 22 billion euros. 700 million euros in annual interest costs, just for Germany. Money that is committed, budgeted, announced to the world, and it is not moving. And while that 90 billion sits frozen, Ukraine is running out of time. After the IMF disbursement, Kyiv's financial runway extends to early May. The EU loan was supposed to arrive by April 1st. That deadline has already passed. The next summit where leaders can revisit the issue is scheduled for late April, which means, at best, the money arrives weeks late. At worst, it does not arrive at all before the election. And Orbán knows the calendar. He built his strategy around the calendar. Every day that passes without a resolution is a day the EU looks weaker and Orbán looks stronger. Every headline that says Viktor is still not budging is a headline that tells Hungarian voters, your prime minister stood alone against all of Europe and did not flinch. He is not just blocking alone. He is running an election campaign at Brussels' expense. And Brussels handed him the stage, the microphone, and the script. This is the trap. Brussels needed Orbán to comply quietly. Instead, he turned every summit, every condemnation, every threat into a campaign poster. Every time Merz calls him disloyal, Orbán's voters hear, Germany is pressuring our prime minister. Every time Costa says nobody can blackmail the European Council, Orbán's voters hear, he is standing up to them. The EU cannot win this public argument, because the optics are catastrophic. 26 wealthy nations ganging up on one small country that just wants its oil pipeline fixed. That is the image, and it is not wrong. One EU diplomat said it out loud after the summit. We all know it is linked to the elections. We are going to have to be creative. Creative. That is the word diplomats use when they have no good options left. They tried persuasion. They tried persuasion. They tried freezing funds, threatening voting rights, drafting lawsuits. And the answer is, we are going to have to be creative. Viktor Orbán left Brussels in high spirits. The EU is going to have to be creative. That is the entire summary of March 19th, 2026. And now the question that matters most. What happens after the election? If Orbán wins on April 12th, and the polls from his own camp show him competitive, then the EU faces the same man, the same veto, the same demands, but now with an election mandate behind him. Every ounce of legitimacy renewed. Every threat Brussels made during the campaign turned into an argument for why he was right. If Orbán loses, his successor Peter Magyar inherits the pipeline dispute. The oil is still not flowing. Hungary still needs energy. the fundamental condition has not changed. Magyar would need to either resolve the pipeline issue or abandon Orbán's position, and face the domestic political cost of handing Brussels a win that Hungary's voters just spent years opposing. Either way, the EU does not simply get its clean resolution. Either way, the 90 billion does not just flow automatically. Either way, the trap remains. Because the trap was never really about Orbán. The trap is about a system that requires unanimity on the most consequential decisions, and then acts surprised when one member uses that unanimity as leverage. Orbán did not invent the veto. He did not create the unanimity requirement. He did not design the system that gives every member state an equal voice on these decisions. The EU built all of that. And for decades, it worked, because every government eventually fell into line. Orbán did not fall into line. And now the EU is discovering that a system built on unanimous consensus has no mechanism to handle the one member who simply refuses to move. That is not Orbán's failure. That is the EU's own design failing in front of the entire world. Viktor Orbán walked out of Brussels smiling. 26 leaders are going to have to be creative, and the 90 billion is still frozen. That is the story. And only one channel is putting all of it in the same frame for you. Subscribe. Hit the like button, because the election is April 12th, and whatever happens that night, you will see the full picture here first.